Welcome to another episode of DVD Review Show. This is a special DVD review show. I'm doing it in a different format this time. Previous this summer, I did this in this format. I like this format, but it takes a lot of time. But just because lately I've been doing a lot of my opinions, and plus this is one of my favorite DVDs. I decided, you know what, if it's going to take 30 minutes, it's going to take 30 minutes. 15 minutes is not enough for this DVD. So, let's hop right into the show, y'all. This is the rise and fall of ECW Extreme Championship Wrestling. So, let's get right into the DVD. This is a documentary DVD. It is produced by WB or World Wrestling Entertainment. It chronicles the history of the Philadelphia-based professional wrestling promotion of Extreme Championship Wrestling, or ECW as everybody knows it. Documentary features interviews with some various performers who worked in the promotion, including co-founder and former owner Paul Heyman, or Paulie E, as well as performers. This documentary concludes with all wrestlers giving their thoughts about what made ECW so special and Paul Heyman. Disc 1 is the chapters, and it's a documentary of the show. Basically, I'm just going to go down with what they highlight. I'm not going to go into details, but, well, I should take that back because I am going into details, but I'm not going to explain every single thing because, you know what, you got to check it out. It goes for early ECW, which is the ECW early days, and they discuss about Eastern Championship Wrestling was before Extreme Championship Wrestling. Extreme Championship Wrestling Paul Heyman made in 95, and before 93, late 92 to early 93 was Eastern Championship Wrestling. And then when Paul Heyman came in there and became the producer and the story writer and the creative team, then it will become Extreme Championship Wrestling. And what I mean by that is he'll bring in the chairs, he'll bring in the hardcore, the blood, the guts. What made ECW, he brought to the table, and he changed it, the wrestling world forever. Then they talk about Public Enemy. Paul Heyman and Taz talked about Johnny Grudge and Rocco Rock, which made Public Enemy. Then you have Taz interviewed, talking about how he got into ECW, where he was working from Japan, and Paul Heyman said, "Hey, you think you can wrestle Sabu?" He's like, "Hell, I'll wrestle anybody, just give me a job." And that's how Taz got into ECW. Then they talk about Sabu, and basically they built ECW around Sabu. And he was just different, Paul Heyman says. Then the night that was crossed, the famous Sabu versus Shane Douglas versus Terry Funk three-way dance, first ever triple threat match for a major world title, or any match kind of like that. Paul Heyman versus WCW, basically Paul Heyman and his history with WCW, with the Paulie Dangerous thing, and about how he hates Eric Bischoff and Ted Turner, stuff like that, how they fired him. The 8th is the Tommy Dreamer, of how he got into his ECW debut on the Discuss. And the Sandman, about how he got Sandman in there, and then the audience loved his entrance, about the beer smashing over him, making him bleed, spitting it out with the single port cane. And basically, quote unquote, he says that the entrance was first and his matches was secondary. Then he talks about the Sandman and Tommy Dreamer feud, about Paul Heyman discusses that, revolutionary at the time, basically because they blend in a reality with storyline about the backstage brawl, and they, at that time you really didn't see a lot of backstage stuff, and they tore down the wall, and it was pretty cool, and about how Sandman got blinded because Tommy Dreamer hit him in the eye after he put the cigarette in his eye. And then, it's just an awesome, and they had their famous storyline. And then you have the ECW Evolution, where Tommy Dreamer discusses how wrestling was filled with gimmicks, where ECW was filled with blood and women and stuff like that. Very reality type. They were basically going for teenagers and grown men when WWE was going for children. basically like that. Then they talk about Cactus Jack, which Mick Foley recounts how he got traded from WCW to ECW and became tag team champions with Mikey Whipwreck. And then the famous Battle of Sabu. And then Future on from getting away from WCW and, then going to WWE and making Mankind and Dude Love and Cactus Jack. And when he was in ECW, he was Cactus Jack. Then they talked about, Mikey Whipwreck explains that how they hired him. He worked on the ring crew, and once in a while they let him go and get his ass whipped in a ring, in a real match, because that was his dream to be a wrestler. They wouldn't give him a lot of moves, basically. Then he talks about how the Extreme begins. Paul Heyman says, they got out of the old school mentality of pro wrestling, and they made it controversial in August 27th of 1994 when Shane Douglas threw the NWA World Heavyweight Championship on the ground, sped on it, and brought out the new ECW Championship. And that's how basically ECW got away from NWA. Then they talk about how Philadelphia was their proving ground, their place to perform. Philadelphia is ECW's town. So, then they talk about the technical wrestlers that they bring in from Japan, like Chris Benoit, Eddie Guerrero, Dean Malenko, stuff like that. Scorpio, Ron Simmons, that established ECW of not just hitting people with chairs, as quote-unquote Paul Heyman says. Then he talks about the production value of the longtime ECW producer and director Ron Buffalo, and he does a little interview talking about, hey, I could feel how this was so powerful in front of a Stone Cold Steve Austin or a Mick Foley, and says they couldn't compete with WWE or WCW on a lighting or a pyro, but what they could beat them on, and they could do anything better. They could do it better on wrestling skills. They could do better on wrestlers. They could do better interviews than anybody else at the time. Basically, what they're talking about. The fans. Paul Heyman, says the fan interaction, which mainly draw the product. Or they went to the arena, and then they could be a part of the show. They could bring weapons. They could throw chairs at the wrestlers. It was just appreciated by that. Then they talk about the Raven-Tommy Dreamer feud, where Paul Heyman says that he had never seen someone embrace a character like Scott Levy, a.k.a. Raven, did with the Raven character, and inspired him to be more creative, quote-unquote Paul Heyman. And then they talk about the Dreamer and Raven feud. And they talk about how Sabu got fired. Taz explains by saying, they were supposed to do a tag match. They did not get along backstage because, they didn't get along. And they show a clip of them basically firing Sabu in the ring. So, then they talk about how Taz broke his neck. Taz talks about how he broke his neck when he teamed up with Eddie Guerrero against Dean Malenko and Scorpio, where he walked to the hospital emergency room, and a favorite quote-unquote by Tommy Dreamer says that Taz walked in to the emergency room, and basically that Taz says that Paul Heyman paid him a minimum guarantee per his contract every week when he was off TV. So basically Paul Heyman paid Taz on just a handshake deal. So, and then we go to the Monday Night War, where Eric Bischoff claims that despite Paul Heyman would have you think ECW was the very first victim of the Monday Night War by having the top and irreplaceable talent that left ECW for WCW. And then, Eric Bischoff and Paul Heyman gets into a little argument, but they're not in the same room. Not saying, WCW rated ECW, and Paul Heyman, or Eric Bischoff says, no, we didn't. And basically talk about how Monday Night Wars affected them by taking the cruiserweights, the lucha libre, whatever you want to call them, from Mexico, about the Japan wrestlers, Ultimate Dragon and stuff like that, the grapplers and mat wrestlers, Chris Benoit, Scorpio, Eddie Guerrero, Dean Malenko, stuff like that. Talks about that. Then they bring in the Lucha Libre, where Paul Heyman says that after WCW stole his talent, he called Conan, which is a wrestling Mexican wrestler who sent over Rey Mysterio Jr. and Psychosis, bringing Lucha Libre to the North American, which was the very first time that any American saw Lucha Libre come to the United States. Only on ECW, and then WCW finally took them. He says that he would have never been able to make ECW, quote unquote, without his dad being a lawyer. And a favorite quote by Paul Heyman: he was sued more times than Martha Stewart. So, then you have Austin. He comes to ECW. Basically, he was fired from WCW over the phone, and he went to ECW, where he delivered several anti-WCW tirades, which was basically promos, which is very good promos. One of the best I've ever seen by a wrestler, present, past, early past, or even that I'm seeing in the future. Then they have a little promo thing with Ron Bofo, which was the producer / he would film basically everything, cut it into pieces, and put it on television. Says that his promos delivered by Steve Austin and Cactus Jack, which I went there earlier, was anti-hardcore remarks, were the best promo, in the history of the wrestling business. Then they talk about Cactus Jack leaving ECW. Cactus Jack gives his thanks to the fans before leaving ECW. Then they had the Taz return. Taz talks about his transformance from the Tasmaniac, which was his very first character when he faced Sabu, his very first match in ECW, and when he broke his neck. But when he came back from a year, he wanted to get a new character. So, quote unquote, Paul Heyman said he brought to the big time atmosphere what was missing from pro wrestling, and Taz became more of the Ultimate Fighter style persona. Then you have Sandman and Raven feud, the legendary Sandman versus Raven feud, which is this guy saying, Raven brainwashed, Sandman's kid and his ex-wife, and did that. Did a little bit of storyline. Quote unquote, Paul Heyman says that was the most emotional storyline ECW have ever done. Then they talk about the BWO, which is the Blue World Order, which was making fun of the New World Order, NWO and WCW, and how it intentionally just got another string of parodies as many aspects of pro wrestling, but almost immediately stuck. It had Stevie Richards, the Blue Knee, and God, I can't remember his name. Nova or Nona. I think it was Nova. Many of you don't know that. Or maybe you do. Yes. Then they talk about the Beulah and Dreamer, which it was Beulah McGillicuddy. Pregnancy angle were discussed about her and Raven, and that whole first ever lesbian angle between Coleman and Wesha. Okay, I don't know how to pronounce her name. And McGillicuddy. And basically they took it off every TV outlet they were on, and they got back on. But anyway, then they talk about the ECW and ECW and WCW feud, where Vince McMahon costly with ECW discussing, starting in 1995 WE pay-per-view King of the Ring in Philadelphia, when fans started chanting ECW during the show, and they brought it in. They had a couple of ECW guys on the outside and stuff like that, and they gave some backstage stories, which was pretty funny, because I was about 2 at the time, and I didn't know about that. But you know what? It's pretty cool to look back and say, hey, I was alive then, and I didn't know what that happened. You just catch up on your history. So, probably many of you were watching that pay-per-view, but hey, if you don't, history, that's what you do. We're living history. You gotta learn your history. If you're a wrestling fan, bam, history. Easiest shit ever. Then they talked about the crucifixion was the infamous October 26th of 1996 between the same man by Raven, and actually Kurt Angle was in the audience that night and explained, give his little outtake of that he was going to go to ECW before he went to WWE or WWF at the time. but he left after the incident, threatened legal action if his image was aired on the same broadcast as the crucifixion, and Paul Heyman claimed that he did not know what Raven was going that far. Basically, what they did was they knocked out Sandman, him and Stevie Richards and the Blue Meanie, tied him up on a cross and hung him on the ring. That is very fucked up. Then they talk about the importance of pay-per-view, or PPV. Basically saying, Taz says that it's expanded the company. You can bring in different vendors and different sponsors to sponsor this event. And pay-per-view networks did not want to put ECW on pay-per-view because they thought ECW was real. They thought they were martial arts, mixed martial arts, or MMA. They thought they were real. But they were pro wrestling. Then they talk about ECW loses their pay-per-view. The mass transit incident on November 23rd of 1996 is discussed. How Barely Legal got taken off the air on Christmas Eve in '96. Then they go back to the pay-per-view is back on. And Paul Heyman in negotiation with the pay-per-view networks, while ECW bombarded the same networks with emails and phone calls and reinstated ECW's first pay-per-view of 1997 as scheduled. So that's how ECW got their pay-per-view back on, because of the fans, because they believed, they loved, and they were ECW. Then they talk about the WWE co-promotion. Vince McMahon said that the ECW co-promotion was good for business for all sides. Jerry Lawler barely hiding the contempt for ECW. They actually brought where, they thought they were better than us with the whole invasion of them. And this was before the invasion storyline in 2001. This was in '97. They were building the pay-per-view. Vince McMahon said, hey, this is good for business. Let's bring in another corporation. Maybe they can help us against WCW. So, and they never got that. They went back and forth about that, talking about it. So, that's what happened on that. Then they go to Barely Legal, their very first pay-per-view of ECW, which was in '97. They talk about the RVD versus Lance Storm match, which RVD, or Rob Van Dam, Vince's frustration on only being a pay-per-view because it was a fill-in after his match. There's a promo after it, basically bitch and complains about it. And they talk about the Taz versus Sabu, which is Taz recaps his near-year-long future with Sabu, saying it was made both of them, make them in a superstar as they are right now. Which is a very cool in-depth story by Taz. In the main event of Barely Legal, which Stevie Richards says that he admits to Terry Funk before the main event, says, I don't know what I'm doing here. He was in the main event. Paul Heyman says that Terry Funk's ECW World Heavyweight Championship win was a possible dream coming true. Stevie Richards says 10 seconds after the pay-per-view went off the air, the power went out. So if it would have lasted 10 more seconds of the pay-per-view, no one would see the pay-per-view because of the air. They pumped so much energy out of the pay-per-view. Event holder, the event, whatever, the place they want to film there, that they would have lost their feed. Then you have the Raven goes to WCW, and Jerry Lawler invades ECW with RVD, Sabu, and Al Alfonso, filling that ECW, or Raven leaving ECW to WCW, was mainly a creative disappointment than a business one, because, Raven is a good wrestler, but he's not the greatest. And basically just talks about that, about how they, Jerry Lawler thought that ECW was the Extreme Championship Wrestling crappiness. Then they go to talking about a locker room mole, Todd Gordon, which was the owner at the time of ECW, or Extreme Championship Wrestling. Supposedly activity and mole is discussion where Bill Alfonso, which was a referee and a manager for RVD and Sabu, and Taz, and Terry Taylor attempted to get several ECW wrestlers to WCW. It's worth noting that on alternate documentary Forever Hardcore that it was claimed that it was a big work. This documentary, however, ECW refers to a real occurrence, so it's kind of up there. Then they talk about the Superstars role, which was Bubba Ray Dudley tells how he became charged of the hiring venues for ECW shows. Jericho mentions that Taz's job was a creative merchandise, basically making shirts. TNA's Slammiversary right here. And Tommy Dreamer and Little Guido, which was Nunzio, and Devon Dudley worked T-shirts. Dreamer also booked shows, and Taz ran the wrestling school. So, and Stevie Richards ran a fan hotline. So, pretty interesting there. Paul Heyman, creative. ECW wrestlers talk about how much an asset Paul Heyman was, of how accessible he was. Basically, you know, Al Snow says, you know, if it wasn't for Paul Heyman, he would not be as popular or a better wrestler as he was, because he brought in, you know, back in the day, you know, Al Snow had the little head where he goes, little white Firestorm head. So, yeah. Then they talk about the ECW and WWE imitation. Wrestlers feel in late '98, ECW was perhaps number 2 of the wrestling organization in the world. Bubba Ray Dudley even felt that to stay that ECW could have perhaps taken over WCW, and then they kind of get in a little argument with Eric Bischoff and Tom Dreamer. Then Taz talks about the FTW title, which was Fuck the World title. Taz discusses the feud with Bam Bam Bigelow in '98 and the genesis of the FTW belt, him and Sabu, and, you know, gives a little funny story about him and Sabu with the little belt and putting, you know, a little white piece of tape over Taz's name, right, Sabu with a marker. Pretty interesting stuff. The Dudleys was the most hated tag team. The Dudley Boys and Paul Heyman discussed how their period of the Dudleys would have been so hated they would insult the fans. Pretty funny stuff of what they did in the ring with the whole fans and giving promos and stuff like that. I'm not going to go in depth with this, but y'all going to have to check it out. Then basically Devon says, you know, there are some times where people will be in the parking lot waiting on us saying, where's your security now? What are you going to do now? What you got? Which,